Okay, so welcome everyone, and welcome Manuel. I'm going to introduce you, Manuel, for those who do not know him. And I have to admit, he was very kind to send a short bio. It's the first time that happens. Usually they don't, but I never asked for that. But thank you very much for that. So I slightly adapted what you sent to me. So Manuel is a final year PhD student in computer science at EPFL. So this is École Polytechnique.
Fédérale de Lausanne. Yeah.
Right, in Switzerland, and is advised by Professor Robert West. Previously, he received MSc and BSc in computer science from UFMG in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, where he was born and raised. And his research focuses on understanding the impact of content moderation, recommender systems, and monetization in online platforms from a computational perspective. His work has been covered in outlets from El País to NBC News, in think tanks like the ICCT, and has shaped products in companies like Meta and Reddit. He is a Meta Computational Social Science Fellow, a Forbes 30 Under 30 awardee, and he has received awards for his teaching and research. So thank you very much, Manuel, for being here, and I'll leave it to you. I don't know if you want to share your screen or...
Yeah.
Um,
So I'll share my screen.
okay.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. So as a context, I'm a final year PhD student. This is my job talk. I've just been in the US for a while now, giving this job talk. So it's a bit, job talkish in a way. So if I sound a bit braggy, you have to forgive me for it. But today I'm going to talk about. I'll jump right in. Today I'm going to talk about online platforms and these are things like Wikipedia or YouTube, Facebook, Tinder, you name it. These platforms play central roles in our lives, and the way that they moderate, recommend, and monetize content mediates their benefits and their harms. And today I'm going to talk about research that can improve these platforms and hopefully in doing so, also improve our society. But before going there, I want to take a step back and propose we all imagine just what would happen if all these platforms just disappeared. And it would disrupt our economies, right? I mean, people buy and sell stuff all the time on Amazon, they order food on Uber Eats, and they download movies on Netflix. It would dismember communities that play important roles in people's lives. Many of us wouldn't be able to keep up to date with the latest papers on Twitter or X or Mastodon, or I don't know what's the newest one now. And not to mention the countless Facebook groups and subreddits and online communities dedicated to interests that range from hiking to growing cactuses. And imagine how hard it would be to learn anything, right? To learn Bayesian statistics or how to remove oil stains from clothes or who won the World Cup in 1994. All of that without Wikipedia or YouTube or Coursera, it'd be very hard. And I could go on and on here, but the point I'm trying to make is that these platforms are deeply embroidered in the social fabric. And in that context, it's not surprising that online platforms are also deeply connected to the societal challenges of the 21st century. Social media, for example, has played a crucial role in the radicalization of people towards extremist ideologies. In this 2019 paper, for example, we showed that many users in the late 2010s went from consuming contrarian influencers to explicitly white supremacist content on YouTube. And radicalization is far from the only concern here. I guess we're all well aware of the potential harms of these platforms to our information ecosystem and to our mental health. But one thing that's important is that we shouldn't assume that these platforms are immovable rocks that we should accept as they are. They're social technical systems that can be tweaked and adjusted. And as a society, we should maximize the benefits and minimize the harms of these systems. And this is what I tried to do during my doctorate. I advanced towards this goal through research that aims to understand the causal effect of content creation practices in online platforms. And let me unpack that because there's two key concepts here. The first one is curation practices. And this is really an umbrella term for what platforms mostly do. They curate. Users on these platforms upload images, they list products to sell, and they make profiles. And platforms curate this content and serve it to other users also on the platform. And there are some key ways in which platforms curate. They determine what to recommend to users, they determine what content to keep and what content to remove, and they determine how to share revenue with users. And a key point here is that these are actionable. If we understand how these curation practices shape online platforms, we can directly improve them. recommended systems can be tuned, and moderation and monetization policies may be adjusted and tweaked. And throughout my doctorate, my work on this has been published at CS conferences and general interest journals in meaningful collaborations with industries and other academic institutions, like the ones I'm showing in this slide. But most important, has had some real-world impact. It has helped shape the public debate, appearing in over 100 news pieces from El País and NBC News, in reports by think tanks, and has informed products in companies like Meta and Reddit that are used by millions of people. But let's get back to understanding the causal effect of content creation practices. Because to understand how research like my own can improve online platforms, we need the second concept, which is causality. You see, descriptive work delineates correlations. And this is very important because it allows us to understand what the word is, right? So this is what we did in that 2019 paper. We answered the question, did users transition to a more radical content or viewership habits on YouTube? But to improve online platforms, we have to go beyond that, right? We have to ask, what if? We have to ask, what would happen if we flipped some switch? And for example, in more recent work, which is just out at PNAS, we answered a related question that goes in this what if direction. We answered the question, if users blindly follow the algorithm, will they be exposed to more radical content? And surprisingly, we found evidence that this is not the case. But the point here is that answering the first kind of question allows us to understand what's going on in online platforms. But the second one allows us to understand how they would change if we intervened. And if we want to improve online platforms, we need to be able to ask this what if kind of question. And okay, so hopefully I managed to set my agenda to some extent, and let me talk a bit about today's menu. So hopefully this appetizer was tasty enough and I was able to convince you that researchers should care about content creation in online platforms. And next, I'm going to talk about two projects related to one of the main ways that platforms curate, which is content moderation. I'm going to talk about moderating comments on Facebook. Then I'm going to talk about the platforming. And I'm going to close things off with my view for future work. But beside this project, what I hope to get across is my research style. I like to tackle real-world issues and provide actionable insights, and I often do so by collaborating broadly across industry and academia. And to draw causal conclusions, I often find natural experiments in large, messy observational data. So let me give a concrete example that puts everything we talked about in practice. And interrupt me at any point, if you guys have questions, or I'll gladly respond. One of the biggest challenges that online platforms face is the proliferation of harmful, mean, toxic content. This kind of content makes interacting on the platform less desirable and is also illegal in many countries. But the problem is that there's too much work for human moderators to detect and delete all harmful content. And therefore, platforms use automated systems to enforce rules. For example, Facebook automatically deletes certain harmful comments, and if you keep posting such comments, your account might be restricted or even banned. And back in 2021, when I was this research fellow from Facebook, I went on to become an intern and a contractor there. And one of the things that struck me was that they did not have a good answer to a very fundamental question, which is, do these automated content moderation systems work? In the sense that, do they make users behave better in the long run? And in an ideal world, we would be able to run a randomized control experiment on this. Whenever a comment is posted and classified as harmful, we would flip a coin and randomly decide whether the comment is deleted or not. And then we could compare the downstream behavior of users in the control and the treatment condition. But what I came to realize is that running such a randomized experiment is very, very tricky inside of Facebook. First, because we would abstain from deleting harmful comments in the control group, which is questionable. But second, because people really hate being in this kind of experiment. And whenever it comes out that a big company run such an experiment, there's a big public outrage. So what should we do? Should we give up? And I mean, we shouldn't, right? Otherwise, I would not be talking about it. But most important, I would argue that figuring out what to do here is important, because most of the data in big data is not experimental data, right? Is this what I would call found data, which is the data generated by the world taking its messy course. So it's very nice if we can find a way to extract causal insights from this kind of data. So let's assume that a randomized experiment is not an option. And let's think about what would happen if we did the naive thing and looked at correlations. We could simply compare users that got their comments deleted with users that did not get their comments deleted on Facebook. And the problem here is that we might really be measuring the difference between harmful and harmless users, because the kinds of users that get their comments deleted are very different from the kinds of users that do not. So this won't cut it. And here's the coolest thing about doing this kind of research. To draw causal conclusions from observational data often requires us to find ways in which data approximates an experiment. This is not trivial, it's very context specific, and it gives you this aha moment, which I hope to share with you today. So let's see how Facebook actually decides whether to auto-delete a comment. They do so with a machine learning harmfulness classifier that scores each comment in a scale from 0 to 1 in terms of harmfulness. To decide which comments to delete, they have some threshold, such that comments that are scored above the threshold are deleted, and comments that are scored below the threshold are not. They are kept, right? They're published. And so far, we gain nothing, right? This is just another way to show exactly the same thing as I said before. I'm just open this black box, which is the classifier. But there's something nice here. If we focus around the threshold, we have that comments that receive scores just above or just below the threshold, they're very similar, but they receive very different treatments. Comments that are right above the threshold are deleted, and comments that are right below the threshold are not. So as long as we focus on comments that are very close to the threshold, we have something very close to a real experiment. We have a natural experiment for free. Okay, so now that we got the gist of it, I must confess that there's a small lie in what I said before. And this lie is that the decisions are made completely deterministically around the threshold. Unfortunately, that's not true, which makes our life a bit more complicated. Reality is a bit more fuzzy. Most social media platforms do not have a single automated process that governs all deletions with a single threshold. For a given classifier with a threshold T, the probability looks more like this. On the x-axis, we have the score that comments receive, centered around the threshold. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of deletion. When the score is smaller than the threshold, there are other mechanisms that might also delete the comments. For example, on Facebook, there are several classifiers. So maybe your comment is being deleted for another reason. But also, when the score is higher than the threshold, there are other classifiers on Facebook to fish out the comments, right? So there are classifiers to prevent comments to incorrectly from incorrectly being deleted. So this is completely fuzzy. The probability doesn't jump from 0 to 1. If this was deterministic, this would be like a 0 up right up to the threshold and 1 after the threshold. But still, there is this discontinuity. It's a fuzzy discontinuity, but there is this discontinuity, and we can still use this as a natural experiment using a methodology called fuzzy regression discontinuity design. And for that, we need two things. The first one is what I just showed you, which is this discontinuity around the threshold in the probability of treatment, which here is deleting the comment, and I'll just write it this as this in this simple equation here, right? So this is just the expected value of x, which is the binary variable corresponding to deletion, right after minus right before the threshold. And the second thing we need is some sort of outcome that we care about, right? And let's say that the first time the user posts a comment with score close to the threshold, we call this day 0. And then we follow this user through the next 28 days, and we calculate in this follow-up period the number of deleted comments that this user had in the follow-up period, subsequently deleted comments, right? So note that we will not count this initial comment that might or might not have been deleted in this outcome. It's just basically you made a comment that is close to the threshold. How many other comments did you get deleted in the days to come, right? And we can calculate this outcome, and we can plot it very similar to the probability of treatment, right? So on this other plot, again, on the x-axis, I have the score, and on the y-axis, I have the expected number of subsequently deleted comments in the 28 days after the user was posted his first comment. And here you can see that there's this sudden decrease, right? And this has to do with the intervention, right? Because users that are right before and right after the threshold are very similar in all regards, and there are all sorts of checks that we did in the paper for that. But when you look at this outcome, it suddenly changes, right? So the second thing we need is this change in the outcome around the threshold. And the big insight of the fuzzy regression discontinuity design is that if we divide these two things, if we divide how much the threshold, the outcome changed by how many people were treated, we get an estimate of the causal effect. More precisely, we get an estimate of the local average treatment effect at the cutoff, which is qualifies where this effect is valid, really, right? And we can estimate that with this methodology called two-stage least squares, which basically we're fitting two simple linear regressions here. The first one, both of them have a baseline and a trend. The first one is basically capturing y as a function of the score. The second one is capturing x as a function of the score. And essentially, we have this dummy variable here, which captures these jumps that I highlighted there, right? So if we get these dummy variables, when we fit these regressions, basically the ratio between these dummy variables is the local average treatment effect. So there's some methodological things that I'm skipping here because they're like annoying, but like, for instance, we have to consider, we have some sort of bias variance trade-off here, because if we consider things very far away from the threshold, they become imprecise. If we consider only things very close to the threshold, we don't have enough data. But there's ways that we can try to estimate this as best as we can, and we have a sound way to identify the causal effect. So I used this study design to analyze almost 500 million Facebook comments posted between June and August 2022. This was done while I was at Meta. And we looked at one specific classifier, which was this violence and incitement classifier, which was one of the three main classifiers used internally. And we looked at two outcomes. The first one was the number of comments in the follow-up period. So like the total number of comments. And the second one was the thing I talked about before, the number of subsequently deleted comments in the follow-up period. And if we look at the effects, we can calculate this effect for different follow-up periods. So in this plot on the y-axis, I'm showing the standardized effect. And on the x-axis, I'm basically showing the different follow-up periods, and these are cumulative, right? And what we find when we look at the engagement, which is the number of comments in the follow-up period, is that on a short run, we have that there's a significant decrease in the subsequent engagement of users on the platform, but that on the long run, this actually becomes statistically insignificant and becomes very small. On the other hand, if we consider the number of deleted comments in the follow-up period, we have a steady decrease in the number in harmfulness across the follow-up periods considered. So, which is nice, right? It means that we're not decreasing engagement with the platform, but we are decreasing like rule-breaking behavior on the platform. So this is nice. And also on the paper, we had this other setup where we looked at the thread level. So we looked at, given that someone had posted like a comment that was or was not deleted in a thread, we basically saw that this led other people to break the rules less as well. You know, so we in this other scenario, we also found evidence of some sort of contagion of rule breaking behavior, which makes sense, right? Someone like writes a nasty thing to you on Facebook and you reply in a nasty way, right? So basically, this is prevented if you remove the comment on the first place. So in short, auto deletion seemed to work, right? And I think this is a good example of the potential impact of research on content curation, because we established this new way to evaluate content moderation, or this automated content moderation without experiments. But second, because this work has had real impact inside of Meta or Facebook. Beyond the key finding, it has changed how they think about moderation, right? So before they used to think about it from this very machine learning angle about what's the precision and the recall of my classifier. But now they really consider how this classifier changes user behavior within the platform. But beyond deletions, in other projects, I have also studied other content moderation practices, in particular around communities. So for example, in another paper with Facebook in 2022, we studied how Facebook communities change after they enforce something called post approvals. And this is just a feature that requires each and every post to get reviewed by a moderator before they land in a Facebook group feed. And there, for example, we found that Facebook groups become centered around fewer, higher engagement posts once they adopt this feature. More recently, I was fortunate as well to help design and test a new intervention on Reddit called post guidance. And the idea here is to provide feedback on whether a rule is being broken as the user prepares a contribution to the community, right? So maybe you're writing something and moderators can basically program some rules that match words and can prevent you from posting or giving you insights that your comment might be rule breaking. And this we did with like a large randomized experiment involving thousands of users and dozens of subreddits, which are these communities on this platform called Reddit. And I believe that there's still a lot of fun work to be done here. We know less than we should about existing practices and how they shape our online spaces. And there's huge opportunity to design new interventions that that could like improve online behavior, improve social behavior in general. And you know, you might think that maybe these are small interventions and that you know, like they're inconsequential because they're so small. But I'll argue that in aggregate they shape online platforms, right? Because these are the bread and butter, and this happen every day across millions of posts and comments and so on. But on the other hand, you have other interventions that single-handedly alter our information ecosystems. For example, banning influential politicians from Twitter or from Facebook. And this is the flavor of the second project I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the platforming. And the platforming is really this umbrella term that has been used to refer to banning acts from online platforms. There's a big complicated debate around whether and when it should be done, with proponents arguing that it can improve online spaces and proponents worrying that the measure might be ineffective and about the potential for censorship. And as a researcher, I think that it's important that we begin by clarifying what exactly is the effect of this practice before we decide on what should be done, which is really not clear, right? But before going there, let me give you a crash course on the platforming. And I'll talk about how it usually goes, and I'll use Parler as a case study here, because this is what I'll talk about later on. And for those who do not know, Parler is a social media platform that was particularly popular among Trump supporters close to the 2020 election. And so the platforming, first, there's some sort of event. And the event here was January 6th and the invasion of the US Capitol. This event increases attention towards the platformed entity. In our case, all eyes went to Parler because it was used during January 6th by a lot of the invaders. And then finally, the platforming happens. And this is caused both by the event and by the increased attention that the platform has received. And Parler specifically was banned from the app stores and from Amazon AWS, which is the hosting company. So basically the platform vanished from thin air into thin air. And again, the question here is, does the platforming work? And we should be specific and narrow down what we mean by work. And here, in the case of Parler, I guess the question is, did the platforming Parler actually change the kind of content that Parler users consumed? Or did they just flock to other similar platforms like Gab, Rumble, and 4chan that had very similar content, right? And I'm calling all these platforms in general fringe platforms in opposition to mainstream platforms like YouTube or Facebook. And once more, we could imagine a hypothetical randomized control experiment that would allow us to answer that question, which is a bit absurd, right? But let's entertain it. Whenever there was a rule-breaking incident in some fringe platform, Amazon AWS, let's imagine that they host everyone, which is kind of true, could flip a coin. You know, Jeff Bezos himself flips a coin and decides whether to blend this platform or not. And then we could compare consumption of fringe platforms in general. among treatment groups, treatment and control groups, right? Among times when Jeff Bezos' coin landed tails and Jeff Bezos' coin landed heads, right? And we could say, okay, what is this doing to the consumption of fringe platforms in online social in online, right? And I mean, I guess I don't have to do a lot of convincing that this is unfeasible, right? Because you can only imagine how happy regulators would be that the banning is done completely at random. So again, we should not give up because this is an important question. And in this case, we don't want to, it's not the case that we don't want to run an experiment, but really that we can't run an experiment. So we have to think about how can we extract causality from observational data. And again, let's assume that we cannot run a randomized experiment, and let's see what would go wrong if we did a simple pre versus post correlational study. We could simply measure attention across a variety of fringe platforms before and after the whole thing happened, before and after January 6th, and the platforming happened, right? And we could capture this delta, the difference in attention before and after. And unfortunately, this would not work because this delta is capturing the effect of deplatforming and of the event that triggered deplatforming. And we can't attribute it to deplatforming alone. So for instance, if deplatforming had a negative effect, but the event that triggered deplatforming had a much stronger positive effect, we would conclude that deplatformed increased attention, but this conclusion would be wrong, right? So this won't cut it. But let's think about how we can decompose this attention. Instead of thinking about this aggregate attention, we could split it by type of user. And this is something I'm making up right now, okay? Let's denote users who before this event mainly used Parler as Parler users, and users who mainly used other fringe social media platforms as fringe users. And let's call everyone else other users. Attention towards fringe platforms in general is nothing other than the attention towards these three categories of users combined, right? So again, I didn't do anything new here. I'm just saying this is another way of looking at attention. We can split it by these three types of users. But again, looking at the data this way allows us to do something nice, right? If we focus on the first two categories of users that I talked about, we can actually extract some causal answers from our questions. So we can run this pre versus post study considering Parler users. We can simply measure attention of Parler users before and after the whole thing happened. And we can extract this delta. And note that Parler users experienced both the platforming and the event, right? And we can do the same thing for fringe users. Fringe users are users who are active in other fringe social media platforms, but not in Parler. And we can also get the delta for these users. But importantly, these users didn't really experience the deplatforming because they didn't use Parler. So it's not like the platform they used vanished. So these users only experienced the event. And the big insight here is that if we assume that these two categories of users would have progressed similarly in the absence of deplatforming, we have that the difference between these two deltas, or as the method goes, the difference in differences between these two types of users is actually the treatment effect, the effect of the platform. And therefore, we can actually simulate an experiment with this observational data that we have once again. But before we talk about the study or the results, let me discuss a concept I've been taking for granted here, which is attention or online attention. And things like page views or daily active users or time spent are very common if you're in Meta or Google, but not so common if you are in academia. And to my great fortune, I came across Duncan and Homa, great collaborators who have access to data from the Nielsen company. Yes, the Nielsen that does the TV ratings created by this guy has gone into the business of tracking online behavior. And Duncan's lab, the CSS lab at UPenn, has access to this massive online panel with the full web history and app usage for over 100,000 users. They have access to also the socioeconomic characteristics of these users. And this data has substantial advantages over the traditional kind of social media data that researchers use. First, because it is cross-platform, which is very important for the study at hand, right? Because we care about attention towards a bunch of small platforms. And second, because it captures passive engagement, right? So when you study tweets or posts, like the kind of users that tweet or post are very special. So they might not be representative of users in general. So with this panel data and with the different methodologies, we went on to study the effect of the platforming on a Parler on online attention. We studied around 1,000 panelists, and these were matched one-to-one according to their socioeconomic characteristics, such that half of them mostly consumed Parler prior to the intervention, and the other half mostly consumed other free social media platforms. And we considered outcomes related to the daily active use of different sets of websites. So we considered the daily active use of Parler, the daily active use of other free social media, and the daily active use of free social media in general, which is really like Parler or other free social media, right? And let me show you how one of those outcomes look like. So here on the y-axis, I'm showing the percentage of daily active users across these two groups of users, Parler users and fringe users. And on the x-axis, I'm showing the time, right? So the month. And we can use this data essentially to do the differences that we wanted to do, right? So we can basically consider the month of December as our pre-intervention period. We can consider the period after Parler was banned as the post-intervention period. We can calculate the deltas that we talked about, and we can estimate the causal effect, the average treatment effect on the treated. And we can do that for each of these outcomes, right? And what do we find, right? So first, looking at the consumption of other free social media platform, we found that there's actually, and this maybe you got the notion that it happened from the previous plot, but we got that there's actually a significant increase in the consumption of other free social media platforms. And here I'm splitting the outcomes by desktop and mobile panelists because we actually had this distinction. If we look at Parler usage, we actually find that Parler usage decreased, which is not super surprising because Parler disappeared, right? So of course it would decrease. But what's most important is what happens once we look at the aggregate. What happens when we look at usage of all kinds of fringe social media, Parler and the rest. And there we find that not much changed. So when we're looking at this aggregate consumption of fringe social media, the results are statistically significant, and they're kind of flipped, right? If you look at desktop panelists, it's slightly above. If you look at mobile panelists, it's slightly below. And for some of the users, we actually had good measurements on how much time they spent on the platforms. And for them, we ran this analysis considering this other outcome, and we found essentially the same thing, right? So the takeaway here is that the platform in Parler didn't seem to work very well, right? So basically, attention towards fringe platforms in general remained mostly the same. And I guess that although this is a negative finding, I think it has a very clear implication that the platforming of a major fringe platform is ineffective in reducing overall activity of fringe social media. So if this is the reason why we're banning these platforms, like it's not worth it, right? And I also like this project because it gives you this methodology to evaluate the platforming with online panels, which are becoming increasingly popular nowadays. There's a lot of initiatives to democratize these panels. And more studies on this are particularly important because, as we talked about in the beginning, the platforming is no single intervention. It's this umbrella term that can apply to entire websites like Parler, but can apply to influencers or to communities, right? And in other work, I also studied the effect of platforming on online communities and on influencers. And effects are heterogeneous, When we look at online communities, for example, we find that the platforming decreases activities in the communities, but that these communities migrate to smaller communities in self-hosted or more liberal platforms that are oftentimes more toxic. And when we look at influencers, we found, for instance, that, like banning influencers from mainstream platforms seems to be effective in reducing online attention towards influencers. as measured with Google Trends or Wikipedia page views. So coming back to the start, I hope these projects give a good idea of how we can understand the causal effect of content curation practices. But at this point, something that you might wonder is, why should we do this in academia? Why shouldn't Meta or TikTok or YouTube do this? They have brilliant researchers in trust and safety teams where they work around topics like content moderation and self-harm. And better, they have access to data and to experiments, right? But at the same time, these companies have been unable to tackle the challenges by themselves. And this is because their incentives are misaligned. Some of the ways to fix online platforms are likely to make them less profitable. Not to mention that these platforms have a narrow view of the ecosystem of online platforms. Meta cares about Facebook and Instagram. Google cares about YouTube. But these platforms are interconnected as they overlap in user bases and functionalities. And that we must at times consider a more systemic view, like in that Parler paper I just talked about. Therefore, I would argue that we also need to do this kind of work in academia. And here the issues are a bit flipped. Our incentives are better aligned and we're better positioned to have a systemic view, but we lack access to data and experiments. And solving this issue is solving this issue is part of my research agenda right now. As future work, I think it would be important to create solid infrastructure to study online platforms. This would mean to come up with new ways to obtain data, for example, recruiting online panels or creating browser extensions that can collect user data or allow users to share their data. And for instance, I've been doing this with this Swiss NGO called Turnusol that provides open source software to tweak recommendations on YouTube. I also want to continue developing new ways of drawing causal conclusions from observational data. We're in the wake of this causal revolution, and quasi-experimental designs like the one I showed can really help us extract golden nuggets from observational data. For example, I'm currently working on expanding the work on Facebook comments for the scenario where we do not know what the threshold is. Can we train our own classifier using the decisions we observe from social media and use the score of this classifier we have access to run some sort of analysis and get some causal conclusion out of it? And last, I think it's important that academia continues to collaborate with industry, but hopefully we can find better ways of collaborating with industry. Europe now is being shaken by the DSA, where companies are required to share data with researchers, and I hope this sparks a new era for collaborations between industry and academia. Let's be optimistic here, right? But also, an orthogonal bit to what I was talking about before, I think another very important direction in the near future is related to artificial intelligence. Because as new technologies like large language models are developed and become popular, they will bring huge challenges to online platforms, but may also enable new content creation practices and new ways of studying online platforms. So for instance, LLMs enable the creation of personalized interventions. When we studied the Facebook deletions, people were shown this generic message. But what if we could tailor messages to different users or explain to users what they did wrong? This is well within the reach of current large language models. So for example, we could use ChatGPT or Gemini or Mistral to do that. And on a more fundamental level, there's this excitement about using LLM to study human behavior in general, right? So there's huge promise in the concept of simulating user behaviors with large language models. For example, we could adjust the system prompt of ChatGPT and specifying a demographic and ask how it would react to specific messages and tweets. And early work has shown promising results in this direction, although we should be very careful around generalizing it because it's also tricky. And one concrete application of silicon samples I'm particularly excited about is to create better algorithmic audits. And let me go back to that PNAS paper I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, where I talked about the effect of YouTube's algorithm. What we did there is essentially to create this notion of counterfactual bots. So we used real YouTube histories from Nielsen data, and we trained pairs of bots, which are computer programs that simulate user behavior, Uh, one set of bots simply watch the same YouTube history as we had on the data. In this case, this is my YouTube history. And the second bot essentially watched the same YouTube history up to a certain point. And after this step, it basically completely and randomly followed the YouTube algorithm. And the idea here is that we can measure the causal effect of randomly follow the algorithm by basically comparing how the recommendations differed between this control bot and this counterfactual bot, right? But why am I talking about this in future work, right? Because I believe that LLMs can power the next generation of auditing algorithms. First, because these online traces that I have is very expensive and hard to come by, right? So could we use large language models to generate realistic user traces to test interventions? Or could we use them to study populations that are very hard to study, like children, right? And populations that we have a lot of concerns around social media as well. Or could we test interventions that would be unethical in human subject, like feeding these models with harmful videos and using subsequent behavior as proxy for real human behavior? These are very incipient, but I think that they could greatly expand our understanding on the impact of online platforms. But besides these fun new directions enabled by advances in AI, these technologies will also bring challenges, right? And for example, there's a lot of concern around AI-generated misinformation and disinformation. And these deeply concern online platforms, right? Because these are the go-to places for scams and misinformation and influence operations. And in this context, I think it's crucial that we try to realistically assess these risks. For example, can we benchmark to which extent LLMs can persuade humans or fool them with artificially generated images? A first dip I did around the potential impact of LLMs is in a perhaps non-obvious scenario, which is crowdsourcing. So, for example, with colleagues from Prolific and Microsoft Research, we studied the usage of LLMs by crowd workers in platforms like Prolific and Amazon Mechanical Turk. And we found that they're actually quite prevalent. 30% of crowd workers on Prolific use ChatGPT in a text summarization task. And this is a huge concern, right? Like, because oftentimes we use these platforms to study human behavior and not LLM behavior. So it could be that this threatens the validity of research using crowdsourcing. And like we say that, oh, everyone is worried about it, but I mean, researchers are tremendously worried about it as well, right? And when you post something like this on Twitter, you get all this like attention and all this coverage because people are scared about like how will these LLMs impact online platforms and the online platforms that perhaps are useful for their own jobs, right? Their livelihoods. But I think that there's so much more here, right? How will these models shape social media now that we can instantly remove people from the background and apply filters that are more and more dystopian? Or how will they impact reviews, right? Now that ChatGPT can read scientific papers and write something that resembles a peer review. And how will it impact e-commerce? It's very hard to find reliable products online, and now like ChatGPT can write reviews, and it's very hard to spot them if you don't happen to have a review that starts with as an AI language model. I think that Gen AI changes the rules of the game in online platforms because it reduces the friction to create content that often looks and often is high quality. And we must understand how this will shape online platforms and how we can prevent negative consequences associated with this new technology. So I hope you all enjoyed today's menu. And if there's something that was too hard to chew during this talk, here you can find pack for the takeaway. Everything I presented was only possible to my amazing collaborators, past and current. So thank you very much, and I would love to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Manuel. That was very interesting. And I mean, considering it's a job talk, I would surely hire you, but I don't know others. You convinced me. But let's see. I think we have already some questions. I saw Luke first and then Steve.
Hello, yeah, thank you for that amazing talk. I thought I'd just add a little cheese course in after the dessert just to finish everything off. I've just, for my dissertation, ran a study that's in a very similar area, looking at AI generated comments and updating of political impressions. And we found that giving a warning prior to showing AI generated comments reduced the amount that people updated their impressions of politicians. So I was just wondering whether or not you think a warning suffices before showing AI generated content in reducing the impact it may have on misinformation and changing people's impressions, or if you think there's a way to alter the thresholds on social media platforms so that they're multidimensional. So if content's created by AI and it's harmful, then it's got a higher weighting in terms of deplatforming that user, if that's possible. I just thought yeah.
Yeah, I'm also like very interested in this kind of direction. Like I just had a study as well on the effect of debating with like a large language model. Like when you have like a full conversation with one, like if this is more or less effective than like a human debater and this kind of stuff. So I think it's very relevant. You know, like the and I definitely think that an important question is like, what's the effect of an AI when you know it's an AI versus what's an effect of an AI when you do not know it's an AI, right? These are like I think these are very hard questions in the sense that they're very like culturally defined. So I could imagine, you know, like people from different backgrounds actually reacting very differently to like the fact that they're debating an AI. You know, they might be more skeptical because they say, okay, this is, you know, like this is something that is just like regurgitating, you know, opinions on the web and it's targeting me, so it's meant to manipulate me. So you have some sort of backlash. But on the other hand, you could have that like people say, yeah, this is an algorithm, you know, so like it must be correct or something like this. So in a way, like, you know, like to me, this is kind of like it's interesting like what we find now, but I wonder, you know, like how would this progress and like our relationship with AI and like layperson's relationship with AI will progress as like these technologies become more present and that people really understand these technologies and so on, you know. So even like, you know, like nowadays, I think that it went very mainstream in the sense that a lot of people have tried ChatGPT or have tried some sort of large language model. And I think that people's opinion will vary like quite a bit around that. And I think this will require a lot of testing to see like whether it works and when it works, right? Because I think that it will this I think this will be one of these like super hard like questions where there's like gigantic heterogeneity and so on, and we have 10 papers and like the papers have slightly different results, not because anyone did anything wrong. So that's my gut feeling. I don't know if you agree or like I don't know, but
No, it's a
but
good point. Yeah, no, I suppose we didn't really control for like we didn't do replications, and I suppose our sample can't necessarily be generalized because it was just cloud researchers on Amazon MTech. So all
yeah,
Americans
no,
are educated, they know what AI
we
is. So yeah.
yeah, which I mean is like it's fine, right? And I think that we should think about this a bit as moving targets in a way. Like for instance, this crowdsourcing research was done like I don't know a year ago. You know, like how much has changed since then, right? Like one of the ways we propose to like reduce usage is actually to use images, but now this doesn't work anymore because ChatGPT does it, right? So I think to some extent we need to have these data points to really understand and like try to understand the underlying mechanisms that lead people to trust and do not trust AI. And but I think it's like it's definitely worth to think about interventions that flag AI as a way to reduce their uh, as a way to reduce like their potential impact, right? So it's you know,
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
no worries.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Really exciting stuff. I have a few comments, sort of questions. First of all, working backwards from what you said about the deplatforming. If I understand it right, you did pick up on the fact that if you deplatform individuals, that actually works. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because my understanding of this literature, and I've seen a bunch of papers on it, although I can't recall right now who wrote them, that typically if you remove particular influences from a network, that has flow-on effects to their neighbors or followers, others in the network, who then become less toxic as well. So it seems to me that is certainly I don't know if I'd call it a consensus, but I've certainly seen a number of papers that show that. And this is not compensated for, as far as I know, by an increase of that activity elsewhere. And even if it were, I think, and I think you're saying this here, the overall attention is reduced. Now, would you agree with that characterization?
So I think that like most of the other work on the platforming, unfortunately, doesn't consider kind of like past like the problem. Like it's technically it's very hard to get the data I had, right? So basically, most of the other work that is done around the platforming actually considers active engagement data. So this means tweets, and in some cases they don't consider like many platforms, you know. So in a way like they don't have a way of knowing that like they say that once the platform someone from Twitter, like users activity on Twitter decrease and they become less toxic on Twitter. But in a way, like most of the other work that doesn't consider this cross-platform interactions is very myopic to what's happening cross-platform. So it's not like they give a definite answer on that, right? So to some extent, like in this case, the work we did there, it was looking at Google Trends and Wikipedia page views. And there we cannot really speak to toxicity because we don't have signals around that. But we do find that there is some sort of like decreased in attention. It's hard to tell, whether they become like, I don't know. I frankly I'm not sure if users become more toxic or not. There are papers on Twitter that when people get banned from Twitter, they become more toxic on Gab, for example, or there is this common theme that like people become more toxic in other platforms, really because the social norms of the other platforms that they participate are looser and they are allowed to post these kind of things, right?
But if their total reach is down, in a sense, that might be a price worth paying.
Yeah, I think it's fair that it might be a price worth paying, and the point here as well is that I think that there's a big difference between banning someone from a mainstream platform and banning someone from a fringe platform, from the get-go.
Exactly.
Because basically, like, if you think about like one way I have some like ongoing work on this, one way that you could try to divide that thing is basically you say that attention that you get in a mainstream platform can be kind of like split between some sort of like deliberate attention and some sort of like coincidental attention, So maybe you're consuming content from this like crazy person on Twitter, not because you're like explicitly set out to consume this kind of content, but it's because it's flashy and it's there and people are reacting to it and maybe people are outraged and so on. But it's not something that you're going out of your way to consume. Where if you're on Parler, like looking at posts on Parler or on Gab, like you're clearly like getting out of your routine to do it, and this could explain a bit this why when we ban things from mainstream platforms, there's a decrease in attention, but why when we ban things from fringe platforms, there's no decrease in attention.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Now, another question I had is more of a question for clarification. When you said, okay, we have a virtual experiment now, if we look at the posts just above and below the threshold, your first line of research, and that's somehow causal. Now, how can you say that? Is this based on the assumption that if people are that close to each other, they're less likely to be powerful confounds between them, so that it's more likely that what is happening here is a consequence of the deletion rather than the fact that these guys are different? Because you said yourself, if you look at globally everything that's either been deleted or not, then you just don't know whether you're talking about nice people versus whatever, other people. So is that the logic that by reducing, by making them closer somehow in some latent dimension, it's less likely that they differ from each other? Is that the rationale?
Yeah, so that's exactly the rationale, right? The rationale there is basically that that there's some smooth, like that the confounders are smooth around the threshold, that this threshold is chosen somewhat arbitrarily, like the fact that the threshold is like 0.1 to the left or 0.1 to the right is smooth. And a big part of running this method actually, to run this method and kind of like be a bit confident on the results, you need two things, right? The first is that you need evidence that people are not self-sorting below or after the threshold, right? So you could imagine a scenario where the user like somehow has this model in their, like in their computer, and they could like slightly alter their message such that it lands right before the threshold. And one way to check for that is basically you check whether the distribution of comments around the threshold is smooth. There's some like statistical tests, but the intuition is basically that there's no like lump of users right before or right after the threshold. Something that you would get, like if you have this threshold for reporting taxes or like mileage of your car or something like this, right? And the second thing you need to do is that you need to actually get some confounders, get some things that you suspect are confounders, or get some like features, and look if like indeed everything is kind of smooth around the threshold, right? Like that the users that you had right before and right after, they're similar in terms of their activity, their age, their so on. So there's some due diligence that you'd have there. And a big limitation of this method, like that it's related to the fact that really is around this threshold, is that these causal effect here that you measure is really like the local average treatment effect at the cutoff, So you really measure the effect at the cutoff. Had you moved the cutoff, it would be a different causal effect because you can only measure the causal effect at the cutoff.
Now, fine, I accept that, but isn't the corollary of this that if you pretend there was a threshold elsewhere, but nothing changes to the posts, you go to whatever, over here on the classifier, that if you then rerun the analysis, there shouldn't be any effect. In other words,
exactly.
And have you done that?
Yeah, and then we have done that, right? So then we flip that. That's another sanity check that you have to do, right? So like you get a random threshold, and then you check that, and then you have to find that outcomes run smoothly. Absolutely.
Thanks. Great stuff. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go. I'm going to curtail the discussion, but I have a hard finish and another meeting. So
no worries. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope we keep talking. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes for maybe a quick question if there is one. If not, I do have a final comment. Like, what do you think, Manuel, of, for example, you talked about automated moderation, right? Automated content moderation, first part. What about maybe crowdsourced moderation, which is kind of like what Twitter does when it comes to misinformation sharing? Like, what do you think? Do you think it's a good practice? Do you think it's worthwhile, or?
Yeah, a lot of the other work I did around content moderation was actually around like these communities. And for Reddit, for Facebook groups, like in some ways, this kind of like decentralized content moderation. It's even more decentralized because on Twitter, you basically have kind of like the same moderation everywhere, right? So like community notes essentially spawns the entirety of Twitter. But in other places, you basically have some sort of like group structure, and I actually think that a lot of the most exciting work around content moderation concerns rethinking kind of like the governance structures around social media platforms, right? So right now we have this kind of like two models of content moderation, which is this kind of like global content moderation where you have a platform like Facebook feed, right? Where basically most of the moderation is done by the platform. And the other one is some sort of fiefdom, right? Where you have these small communities that have these like benevolent dictators, right? Where they basically moderate, they donate their time and they moderate that. But you don't have any sort of like democracy. You don't have, like very few places have more sophisticated governance structures. One of which is Wikipedia, right? Which is this huge success in terms of community formation and so on. So I think that kind of like both thinking about how this moderation can be crowdsourced and like made more democratic, but also thinking about how you can actually have some sort of different governance structures that would allow people to moderate and to have accountability and so on and so forth. I think this is very interesting and something to consider as well. Reddit is a great place for that. Like it's a very like fun community, and I think that there's a lot of space to do studies on that. And oftentimes it's nice, you can ask the communities. Since the communities are smaller, it's like easier for you to collaborate as a researcher with these communities. You can ask them, you can like approach the mods and so on. So it's something that's worth keeping in mind. Study that.
Great. Thank you. Well, we are right on top of the hour, so I think maybe we can wrap it up here. And thank you very much again, Manuel, for this talk.
No
and
worries.
thank you everybody whoever is left. And
Thank you.
I'll see you around, and maybe we'll keep in touch. Okay?
Yeah. Thanks for the invite.
And
It was
good luck
very
for your
nice.
future, like for your job hunting.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. I hope so too.
Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.